This is one of a series of good answers presentations, offering evidence to answer skeptical challenges to the Bible's accuracy. I've titled it, The Importance of Olive Pits. Now, if you've ever bitten into an olive carelessly and been surprised to find a pit, you may think of them as useless and even dangerous. But in this context, well, perhaps we should just wait and see what importance they can have. Our subject today begins with one of the most controversial questions in biblical history. What is the truth about the kingdom of David and Solomon? Is there archaeological evidence that supports the Bible's claim that they ruled over a mini-empire that stretched from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south? A kingdom feared by Philistines, Moabites, and Edomites, and respected by the Phoenicians and Egyptians? A nation like that must surely have left some physical traces for us to find. Almost a century ago, archaeologists began to claim that they were finding just such traces. Scholars like William Foxwell Albright pointed to the massive fortified cities that were being unearthed all over Israel. Throughout the 20th century, we saw the excavation of Hatzor, of Gezer, and of the enormous site at Megiddo. The Bible referred to these cities as ones that Solomon had either built or enhanced, and there they were for all to see. And more recently, there were the copper mines on the border of Edom, down south of the Dead Sea, just as the Bible had implied. The archaeologists emphasized that the cities had fortifications all in the same style, gate complexes with 4 or 6 chambers flanking the approach to the gate proper. Highly valuable for defense, this technique made attackers vulnerable, since they would be exposed on both sides as they tried to storm the gate. And the fact that the cities all had similar fortifications showed that they were built around the same period, the time of David and Solomon, in Israel's united kingdom. It all sounded good for those who trusted the Bible's account, until the arrival of the minimalists. Beginning 30 or so years ago, a school of historians arose who took a more skeptical approach to Scripture. Their view was that we could not trust historical statements about this early period in Israel's history unless there was independent evidence outside the Bible to confirm what it said. In other words, the Bible was guilty unless proven innocent. And so the Bible's record of the kingdoms of David and Solomon came under suspicion. These scholars admitted that the archaeological finds were important, but they said they belonged to a later time. A National Geographic article tells us this about the most famous minimalist, Professor Israel Finkelstein. Quote, he and other proponents of the low chronology say that the weight of archaeological evidence in and around Israel suggests that the dates posited by biblical scholars are a century off. The Solomonic buildings, excavated by biblical archaeologists over the past several decades at Hatzor, Gezer, and Megiddo, were not constructed in David and Solomon's time, he says, and so must have been built by kings of the 9th century BC's Omride dynasty, well after David and Solomon's reign. End quote. Finkelstein and Silberman set out this theory at length in their book from 2002, The Bible Unearthed. So then the question one faces is, who built these cities with their massive walls and their 4 or 6 chamber gates? Throughout most of the 20th century, archaeologists had dated them to the time of David and Solomon. David's reign is usually dated from 1010 to 970 BC, and Solomon's from 970 to 930. Upon Solomon's death, you will recall that his son Rehoboam foolishly alienated the tribal leaders, and 10 of the 12 clans broke away to follow Jeroboam in the north. We were left with a divided kingdom. Jeroboam was succeeded in turn by Nadab, then Baasha, then Elah and Zimri in one tumultuous year, to be followed by Omri. Omri founded a new dynasty, and left a stronger kingdom for his son, the infamous Ahab, and his even more infamous wife, Jezebel. The minimalist's argument, then, is that these cities were not built by David and Solomon, but by Omri and Ahab, about a century later. If that's true, then we seem to have no visible remains of the United Kingdom at all. What does this mean for our understanding of the Bible's picture of King David? For the minimalists, it's quite clear. That same National Geographic article explains, quote, "During David's time, as Finkelstein casts it, Jerusalem was little more than a hill country village. David himself a raggedy upstart, akin to Pancho Villa, and his legion of followers more like 500 people with sticks in their hands, shouting and cursing and spitting, not the stuff of great armies of chariots described in the text." End quote. And so, if we accept this view, the great King David dwindles before our eyes, and nearly disappears. But our story has only begun, and the next chapter is found in the valley of Elah, some 30 miles southwest of Jerusalem. Students of the Bible know it as a historic place, where young David confronted the Philistine giant Goliath, defeated him with a stone from his sling, and took off his head. It was to this valley, in 2007, that another Israeli archaeologist came, Yosef Garfinkel. He came there to check out a site that has the Arabic name of Khirbet Jaffa. You see, an Israeli park ranger had mentioned to him that there seemed to be traces of a wall there that somebody ought to investigate. Garfinkel began an archaeological dig in 2008, and soon found that there was a city there. And a wall? Oh yes. He estimated that some 200,000 tons of stone were included in the city wall. The gate on the east, in fact, included individual stones weighing 10 tons. This was, then, clearly a city that had required major resources and efficient organization to build. One striking fact was that the city had 2 gates. In fact, this is the only city so far found in Israel that has exactly 2. The Hebrew term for 2 gates is Sha'arayim. Garfinkel also discovered that of some 3,000 animal bones examined from the site, none were from pigs. And he found there some small aniconic shrines. Shrines obviously made to honor some deity, but not containing any representation of the god. These only make sense if the worshippers intended to obey the biblical prohibition against making any image of God. And the further clue was a single sherd of pottery, with a few lines of writing on it, writing in Hebrew. All these clues point in the same direction. This had to be a Jewish city. But which one? Archaeologists often unearth an ancient town or city, and then can't be sure what city it was. After all, they don't usually find a "Welcome to" sign put up by the local Chamber of Commerce. But Garfinkel recalled a passage from the book of Joshua. The following towns situated in the western foothills were also given to Judah: Eshtaol, Soka, Azekah, Sha'arayim. Joshua 15:33-36. And Sha'arayim means 2 gates, the right name in the right place. So he was able to identify this town from the Bible's own text. Of course, archaeologists always need to date their finds. To what period did the city belong? Dr. Garfinkel found that this site was inhabited at only 2 periods, widely separated in time. The more recent traces dated to the Hellenistic period, the 3rd or 2nd centuries BC, and there was a much earlier period of habitation. The pottery from this earlier time was characteristic of what the specialists call Early Iron Age 2A. But here there was a problem. The traditionalists and the minimalists disagreed about what the actual dates were for Early Iron Age 2A. Traditionalists would put it around 1000 BC. But the newer minimalist school used a so-called lower chronology. They put it a century later, around 900 BC. So the pottery couldn't settle the dating question. But these days, as we all know, archaeologists have another dating tool that they use whenever possible: carbon-14. Anything that has ever been alive, whether plant or animal, can be dated with this process, which examines the ratio of normal carbon, carbon-12, to radioactive carbon-14 in the substance. The less C14, the older the material is. Garfinkel sent out 4 olive pits he found at the site to 4 different radiological labs in hope of getting the most accurate dating possible. They came back with a date range of 1000 to 969 BC. Do you recall the dates for David's reign? 1010 to 970 BC. Sha'arayim belongs, then, to the latter part of the time of King David. The archaeologists tell us what it meant. Quote, "Very important to us is the association of Sha'arayim with King David twice in the biblical tradition. Sha'arayim is not mentioned in conjunction with any other later First Temple period tradition. This observation is consistent with the archaeological and radiometric data that indicate a single-phase settlement in the early 10th century BCE at Khirbet Qeiyafa." But if we have here a fortified Jewish city, far from Jerusalem, from the time of King David, this represents a big challenge for the minimalist school of historians. After all, they have argued consistently that there was no united kingdom. Indeed, nothing that could be called a kingdom at all. David was, in their view, a minor chieftain with perhaps a few hundred followers. The archaeologists were quick to point out that the minimalists had a problem. Quote, "You have David and Goliath, and you have our site, and it fits," says Garfinkel simply. "It's typical Judea, from the animal bones to the city wall. Give us 2 arguments why this is Philistine. One argument is because Finkelstein doesn't want us to destroy the low chronology. Okay, so give us a second reason." Well, if this is not a Jewish town, the only other possibility would be that it is Philistine, since it's right out there on the border of Philistine territory. But it's easy to see that Dr. Garfinkel has little respect for that notion, or for the minimalist position. And do you recall that one of the finds there in Sha'arayim was a sherd of pottery with writing in Hebrew? That tells us something rather important about the story of David and Goliath. As we know, many liberal scholars claim that the historical books of the Old Testament were written long after the times they describe. Genesis and the other books of the Pentateuch were not written by Moses, they tell us, but almost 1,000 years after Moses. As for Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, they were only written several centuries after the times they record, around 600 B.C. So, of course, the tale of David's fight with Goliath from 1 Samuel would have to be a legend, at best, having been passed down orally for centuries before it was finally written down. Why, it couldn't have been written at the time of David, because there's no evidence that the Hebrews were even producing literature that early. But now there's that sherd of pottery. Garfinkel understands its importance. Quote, "The biblical tradition does bear authentic geographical memories from the 10th century BCE Elah Valley. There is no ground for the assumption that these traditions were fabricated in the late 7th century BCE or in the Hellenistic period. Furthermore, the 5-line inscription uncovered at Khirbet Qeiyafa clearly indicates that writing was practiced in this region. Thus, historical memory could have been passed down for generations, until finally being summarized as the biblical text." End quote. We should be careful not to misunderstand Dr. Garfinkel here. He is not a biblical conservative, insisting, as we might, that 1 Samuel was written in the lifetime of David. He assumes, as so many others do, that those historical books were written much later. But he wants to point out that what he has found proves that the Jews were indeed writing in David's time, and so there could very well be accounts about his life that were written at the time, to be incorporated into 1 Samuel at a later time, when he believes that it was written. We might note, though, that this same evidence shows that the Jews had the techniques to write books like 1 and 2 Samuel in the 10th century. So why must we assume that they were only written much, much later? So then, a conservative student of Scripture could be quite comfortable in believing that this passage was written during the lifetime of King David himself. "Then David ran over and pulled Goliath's sword from its sheath. David used it to kill him and cut off his head. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah gave a great shout of triumph and rushed after the Philistines, chasing them as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron. The bodies of the dead and wounded Philistines were strewn all along the road from Sha'arayim as far as Gath and Ekron." Did you notice the mention of Sha'arayim there? Of course, this fortress city would not have been built yet when David was still a youth. Nor would it have been there in Joshua's time, when that passage we saw mentions it among a list of cities, though there may have been a small village there under an earlier name. But all the evidence suggests that it was first fortified in the time of King David, and by his people. Still, mentions like these are not unusual in a historical account, where the writer will refer to a landmark that his readers know in order to help them orient themselves, even when the reference may not be strictly accurate for the period he's referring to. An old-timer might say of his youth in St. Louis, "I used to play right under where the Gateway Arch is," though it only dates from 1965. One significant point here is that of the 3 instances that Sha'arayim is mentioned in Scripture, 2 are associated with David, and that we now have evidence of a Jewish fortified city from the time of King David. Plus, one more thing. Those 2 gates at Sha'arayim, They are 6-chamber gates, and in a town securely dated to the early 10th century B.C. That tells us that the other cities we saw, Hatzor, Gezer, and Megiddo, also date from the same period. All of them, then, were constructed or enhanced in the early 10th century, the time of David and Solomon. And if we plot those locations on a map, we get a good indication of the extent of the kingdom that built and manned them. So what was David's realm really like? 500 people with sticks in their hands, shouting and cursing and spitting. Huh? Not hardly. So, an archaeologist uncovers a city in the valley of Elah, where David fought and defeated Goliath. It turns out to be a Jewish fortified city. But from what era? He submits 4 olive pits for carbon-14 dating, and gets back a range of 1000 to 969 B.C. But that gets him more than just a date for Sha'arayim, because its gates are in the same style as those of Hatzor, Gezer, and Megiddo. He can now point to cities up and down the extent of Israel, all from the 10th century B.C., and the only way to explain them is a central power directing it all. So he gets one more thing from those 4 olive pits: a king in Jerusalem. Welcome back, David. If you should have questions about this lecture, or any of the others in the Good Answers series, you may direct them to me, Dr. Jerry C. 4 at yahoo.com.